does your everyday life look like? Is it a relentless grind of dragging hours, weighed down by responsibilities, decisions, and the world rests on your shoulders? Or perhaps it's a turbulent sea of emotions, tossing you between extremes, leaving you exhausted but empty. Take a moment to truly observe your life. Do you find yourself just going through the motions, trudging through your daily routine like a deep, dark valley, eyes fixed on the next task, but never fully present in the now? The real problem isn't what we do, but why we do it. When we live by our feelings, our actions become mere reactions to external stimuli. We act when pleasure beckons, we pray when we feel comforted, we love when it's easy. But what happens when joy hides its face? When dark clouds gather and our souls feel hollow and empty, does our faith remain active? The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:7 gives us a powerful directive, for we live by faith, not by sight. This is our call, our challenge. Faith isn't about what we see, touch, or feel. It's rooted in something deeper, something unshakable, something that doesn't bend to the winds of circumstance. But living this kind of faith requires a radical act, surrendering our will to God. Consider the quiet strength of a surrendered will. It's not a flashy, boisterous force. It doesn't clamor for attention like fleeting enthusiasm. It's a silent, persistent power. The bedrock that keeps us faithful when our hearts are broken, our bodies weary, and the temptation to give up whispers in our ear. Many believe that following Christ means a life of perpetual sunshine, a heart overflowing with joy, as if happiness were the ultimate proof of our faith. But this is a dangerous illusion. Sometimes obeying God leads us not to pleasure but to pain. Remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, crushed by the weight of the world, knowing the suffering, the loneliness, the cross that awaited him. His prayer, raw with anguish, reveals the unwavering surrender of his will. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Luke 22:42. This, not a constant high, is the essence of a life of faith, a will yielded to God. But how do we live this out practically, day by day? How do we cultivate this surrender amidst the roller coaster of modern life? Many of us wrestle with our emotions constantly. When things are going well, we feel invincible, ready to take on the world. But when difficulties arise, a job loss, an illness, a fractured relationship, it's easy to let those feelings drive a wedge between us and God. He feels distant, silent, uncared. But the truth is, he's never been closer. The question is, are we willing to obey even when our hearts feel numb? The danger of feelings-based faith is that we become slaves to our circumstances. We love God when we feel his presence, but drift in the silence. We praise when joy overflows, but neglect the altar when tears run dry. We serve when we're recognized, but retreat when the work is thankless. True obedience is dictated by fleeting emotions. It's born from a will consistently surrendered to God in every decision, every single day. This doesn't mean we should suppress or ignore our emotions. They are part of who we are, woven into the fabric of our being, and God values them. But we can't let them steer the ship. Imagine a small boat adrift, tossed about by the unpredictable whims of the wind and waves. This is a life lived at the mercy of feelings. But the Christian, grounded in a surrendered will, is like a ship with a firm anchor. The winds may howl, the storms may rage, but the anchor holds fast, securing the vessel to something stronger, something immovable. This anchored faith, however, requires intentionality, discipline. It's a commitment to trust God even when life feels bleak and purposeless, to obey even when our hearts feel like a desert. It's a faith that stands firm, not on what we feel, but on who God is. In today's culture, obsessed with comfort and pursuit of fleeting happiness, this is a radical stance. We're constantly told to follow our heart, to chase our dreams, to avoid anything that might cause discomfort. But Christ's call is a countercultural invitation to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow him, even when it costs us everything. This call to self-denial, to surrender, can feel incredibly difficult. It goes against our natural inclination to cling to control, to chart our own course. Yet, it's in this surrender that we discover true freedom. It's in this yielding of our will that we tap into a strength beyond our own, the boundless strength of God himself. And it's in this obedience, often painful and counterintuitive, that we experience the vibrant pulse of true spiritual life. Many stumble here, mistaking the ebb and flow of emotions for the presence or absence of God. When the initial fervor fades, when the tears dry up, when the emotional high dissipates, they wonder if God has abandoned them. But this is a lie whispered by the enemy. God isn't limited by our feelings. He is with us even when we don't feel it. The problem is the absence of feeling. It's the absence of a surrendered will. So, If your faith feels weak and brittle, don't fixate on your feelings, examine your will. Ask yourself, am I willing to obey God even if it means walking the desolate wilderness? Am I willing to trust His word even when everything around me screams otherwise? Am I willing to serve Him even when my heart feels empty and the applause has faded? Remember, God isn't impressed by our fleeting emotions. He's moved by the sincerity of a surrendered heart. He delights not in our emotional highs, but in our unwavering desire to do His will above all else. He cherishes our faithfulness, even in silence, even in pain, even when shrouded in darkness. Living this way isn't easy, but it is possible. It's a daily walk, a moment-by-moment choice. And as we learn to trust God, to obey His will, something extraordinary happens. We discover that our joy doesn't depend on external circumstances or fleeting emotions, but on the deep-seated knowledge that we are walking in His will. We discover that even in the darkest valleys, we can experience peace that transcends human understanding. So, don't let your feelings dictate your life. Surrender your will to God. Trust Him even when the path ahead is shrouded in darkness. Obey His word even when you feel nothing. Remember, your faithfulness, your unwavering surrender, is far more precious in God's eyes than any fleeting emotion. The Christian life isn't a journey of constant emotional highs, but of a will firmly anchored in the grace and love of God. Walk this path, and you will discover the true peace, the authentic joy, the unshakable freedom that only He can offer. Write in the comments, God, I want your will, if you're willing to abandon your own plans and align yourself with His. We often carry a heavy burden when we believe faith must always be accompanied by ecstatic feelings and fervent emotions. How exhausting that pursuit becomes. We chase fleeting sensations like someone desperately searching for water in a mirage-filled desert, never finding true satisfaction. This year, in time together, Albert and I have registered for the Iron Fortune Hermit. True joy isn't found in perfect circumstances or emotional highs. It's discovered in an obedience that needs no explanation, no reward. That is the kind of faith that sustains us. A will that perseveres even when our bodies are weak and our hearts feel empty. God doesn't call us to be driven by our feelings, but to live in deep dependence on His unshakable word. There will be times when obedience feels dry and barren, like a parched and lifeless land. You might cry out, "How can I continue, Lord, when I feel nothing?" This is a question many ask, but few dare to answer. The answer, however, isn't found in chasing after a feeling, but in simply continuing to obey. True spirituality isn't measured by our emotional state, but by our willingness to say yes to God, even when our hearts resist. It's the decision to move forward, even when everything within us screams for surrender, that reveals the depth of our faith. Many Christians stumble here. When the initial fire of emotion cools, they question their relationship with God. When the tears stop flowing, when the shivers of spiritual ecstasy fade, they fear something is wrong. But what if these quieter moments are when God is closest? What if it's in the silence that He molds us, refines us, prepares us for something more? The absence of intense emotion doesn't equal the absence of God. On the contrary, it can be evidence of His deeper work within us, weaning us from our dependence on feelings and leading us to a trust that rests solely in Him. Desire to obey God should be our bedrock, our foundation. It doesn't matter how we feel, it doesn't matter if tears flow freely or if heaven seems silent. What matters is our persistent yes, our unwavering commitment. Lord, here I am, do your will in me. This is the ultimate expression of faith, the purest demonstration of love. We don't love God for what He gives us, but for who He is. And when we grasp this truth, our entire lives are transformed. Think about those times when you feel stuck, when work becomes monotonous, relationships grow stale, and even your spiritual life feels like it's lost its spark. In these moments, the temptation to give up, to abandon the journey can be overwhelming. You might be tempted to search for something, anything, to rekindle that initial excitement. But this is where true faith shines. A faith that doesn't require fireworks or constant affirmation, a faith that doesn't require any fooled whispers, "Lord, I trust you." 6. Have you ever noticed how seemingly small, almost invisible acts of obedience can shape our lives? It's in the daily grind, the mundane details of everyday life, that our will is truly revealed. It's not the grand gestures or the moments in the spotlight that define our relationship with God, but the quiet choices we make when no one is watching. When we choose to love, even when our hearts feel cold. When we choose to forgive, even when the hurt still throbs. When we continue to pray, even when heaven seems silent. These seemingly insignificant decisions are, in fact, the most powerful, because they are the meeting place, our will and God's will, the building blocks of an unshakable faith. Now, if you honestly examine your life, you'll likely see how easily emotions can lead us astray. When they're high, we feel like we can conquer anything. When they plummet, our world caves in. This emotional rollercoaster drains us, robs us of peace, and distracts us from our true purpose. But God calls us to something higher, something more stable. He calls us to a faith that doesn't waver with the changing tides, a faith anchored not in fleeting feelings, but in the bedrock of His Word. See how this applies to every area of your life. At work, you face difficult days, situations that test your patience and integrity. Your commitment to doing what's right must prevail, even when every fiber of your being wants to act differently. In marriage, you'll inevitably experience moments of frustration when love feels distant and the weight of commitment feels heavy. But it's in these moments that the choice to love, to give, to remain faithful becomes the purest expression of your faith. In your relationship with your children, you may feel inadequate, overwhelmed, but choosing to invest in them, even when you don't see immediate results, demonstrates that your trust isn't in your own abilities, but in God's faithfulness. These moments, as ordinary as they may seem, are the proving ground of our faith. Never underestimate the impact of small acts of obedience. Every time we surrender to God's will, even when our hearts are reluctant, we plant a seed in fertile ground, and in time, that seed will blossom and bear fruit. But for that to happen, we must learn to trust in God deeply, truly. This isn't easy. Trusting in God requires relinquishing control, loosening our grip on the reins of our lives, and allowing Him to lead. It means accepting that even when we don't understand, He knows the way, He knows what's best. And for many of us, this is the hardest part. We crave certainty, want to feel in control. But God calls us to something different, something more profound. He calls us to trust. And what happens when we trust? We discover a freedom unlike any other. We find peace in the midst of the storm, light in the deepest darkness, and a voice that speaks to our hearts even in the silence. This is the essence of the Christian life. It's not about feeling, but trusting. It's not about what we can do, but what God can do through us. Remember the psalmist's wisdom. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will do this. Psalm 37, verse 5. It's a simple yet profound promise. God doesn't ask us to understand everything, to solve every problem, to control every outcome. He simply asks us to commit, to trust, and when we do, we discover His unwavering faithfulness. He has always been faithful, and He always will be. So don't be fooled by the deceptive nature of emotions. Don't let them be the barometer of your faith. Your walk with God isn't defined by how you feel, but by what you choose. Choose obedience, even when it's hard. Choose trust, even when it doesn't make sense. Choose love, even when it's not reciprocated. These choices, made in the quiet moments of everyday life, carry eternal weight. And as you walk this path, remember you are not alone. God is with you in every step, in every decision. He sees what no one else sees. He knows your heart, your struggles, your doubts, and He is at work even when you can't perceive it. Trust Him, obey Him, and you will discover that in the end it was all worth it, because God always honors those who choose to follow Him wholeheartedly, even when the path is uncharted and the future uncertain. Write in the comments, "I love the Holy Spirit," if you recognize His constant care and unwavering love. As we journey with God, there are times when we desperately crave immediate relief. We want shortcuts, quick fixes, instant solutions to dissolve our pain. But God doesn't operate on our timetable. He works in eternity, while we are often trapped in the urgency of the now. This tension between what we want and what God is doing is where our faith is tested, refined. There is no growth without facing challenges. There is no maturity without Him. And there is no true communion with God without the complete surrender of our will. But what does surrender truly mean? It's not a one-time event, it's a continuous daily practice, a constant yielding of our desires to God's perfect plan. It's releasing the need to control, to question, to demand. It's recognizing that God is sovereign, and His will, even when we don't understand it, is good, perfect, and pleasing. Think about how often we cling to our own plans, resisting God's guidance. We want Him to conform to our desires, to adjust His infinite wisdom to fit our finite understanding, but God doesn't yield to our weaknesses. He invites us to yield to His strength. There is profound power in God's silence. Sometimes when we cry out and hear no immediate answer, we despair, believing He has forgotten us. But God's silence isn't absence, it's a different kind of presence. It's in the silence that He works most deeply within us, shaping our character, strengthening our faith, and preparing us for what lies ahead. When everything around us feels still, when our prayers seem to go unanswered, it's then that we learn to walk by faith, not by feeling. It's in this apparent emptiness that our will is truly tested. There is no virtue in obeying God only when things are easy, no merit in trusting only when circumstances are favorable. The true test of faith comes when the ground crumbles beneath our feet, when the sky above turns dark, and all that remains is the unwavering promise, "I am with you." It was the same for Abraham when God asked him to sacrifice. Abraham didn't have all the answers, but he had something far greater, the unwavering certainty that God is faithful, even when his requests seem impossible to comprehend. And that certainty was enough. Now, bring this truth into your own life. Where have you struggled to trust? Perhaps it's a decision that defies logic, a call to leave behind something you love, something God is asking you to surrender. Or maybe it's simply the challenge of persevering day after day, feeling the weight of responsibility, the dryness of routine. In these moments, the most important question isn't, how do I feel, but to whom do I belong? Because if we belong to God, our will is no longer our own, and when we surrender our will, we surrender our lives. This surrender, however, isn't an act of weakness. It's an act of courage, a demonstration of profound trust in a God who never fails. But how difficult it is to relinquish control. Something within us resists, fights to hold on to the reins at any cost. We are like children, clinging tightly to our Father's hand, yet still trying to dictate the path. God, in his infinite patience, holds us even as we resist, guides us even when we stubbornly insist on going our own way. But how much easier, how much more peaceful, if we would simply let go and trust. And here lies the paradox. True freedom is found only in surrender. The more we yield to God, the freer we become. The more we trust in his sovereignty, the less we're tormented by the uncertainties of life. The more we obey his word, the more we experience the peace that transcends all understanding. This peace doesn't come from the absence of problems, but from the presence of God amidst them. It's not rooted in fleeting feelings, but in an unshakable trust in his goodness. Even so, there will be days when doubt casts its shadow over our hearts. We question our path. We wonder if God is truly with us. These thoughts are normal, and God doesn't condemn us for them, but he invites us to look beyond them, to remember who he is, to recall his promises, to cling to his faithfulness. When everything around us feels uncertain, when our own hearts waver, God's word is our anchor, our guiding light in the darkness, the steady hand that keeps us from being swept away by the storm. Remember, God doesn't abandon us halfway. He is the author and finisher of our faith. What he begins in us, he is faithful to complete, and the certainty should empower us to keep going, even when fatigue threatens to paralyze us. It's not about ignoring our weaknesses, but about bringing them to God, knowing his grace is sufficient, knowing his power is made perfect in our weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. So, how are you living your faith? Is it fueled by fleeting emotions, or anchored in obedience? Is it driven by your own desires, or marked by surrender to God's will? These are tough questions, but vital ones. True spirituality isn't measured by what we do when everything is easy, but by the choices we make when everything seems lost. And it's these choices that define who we truly are. We're not called to live by what we see or feel, but by what we believe. We're not called to seek comfort, but to seek God. We're not called to avoid suffering, but to carry our cross, knowing it leads to true life. This is the heart of the gospel. This is Christ's call to each one of us. So, as you walk this path, remember you are not alone. God is beside you, sustaining you, guiding you, shaping you. He sees your struggles, your tears, your doubts, and he uses every single one of them to fulfill his purposes in your life. Trust him, surrender to him, and discover that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is a peace that cannot be taken away. A joy that transcends feelings, and a hope that never fades. Write in the comments, God, illuminate my path, if you believe he is guiding you, even in your darkest moments. When we understand that we're not walking alone, something within us begins to shift. It's not a loud, visible change, but a quiet, profound transformation. The certainty that God is with us, even in the shadows, creates a new posture of the heart. We finally understand that the journey isn't dependent on our own limited strength, but on the limitless strength he pours into us. Every step, even the trembling ones, is sustained by his hand. Every weakness is covered by his grace. Every doubt is met by his faithfulness. Still, the process takes time. There will be days when you feel like you're moving backward, when the weight of your limitations makes you question whether you can truly live this surrendered life, this life of radical obedience. And on those days, when fatigue threatens to overwhelm you, God invites you to look to him, not at yourself, not at your failings, but at him. It's when we take our eyes off the waves that we can walk on water. Remember Peter, stepping out of the boat to meet Jesus, walking on the sea as long as his eyes were fixed on the Master. But when the wind howled and the waves crashed, he looked away and he began to sink. How often do we do the same? God calls us to a life of obedience, to a journey that challenges the impossible. And for a while, we believe, we trust, we take that first step of faith, but then the storms of life hit, the pressures of everyday life, old fears, persistent doubts, and as we fixate on the wind and wave, how often do we do the same? God calls us to a life of obedience, to a journey that challenges the impossible. And for a while, we believe, we trust, we take that first step of faith, but then the storms of life hit, the pressures of everyday life, old fears, persistent doubts, and as we fixate on the wind and wave, He is always ready to lift us up, to set our feet back on solid ground. This is the love that sustains us. We are not perfect, we are not consistent, but He is. His faithfulness doesn't depend on ours. His presence doesn't disappear because we stumble. On the contrary, it's often in our stumbles that He holds us even closer. So what do? We continue. We rise. We choose to obey again and again. Because the Christian life isn't defined by the absence of falls, but by the willingness to get back up every single time. And as we continue, something remarkable happens. Our will, once so fragile and fickle, begins to align with God's will. What was not because our circumstances have changed, but because we have been transformed. And when we are transformed, the impact ripples outward. Our quiet obedience, our persistent faith, our small daily decisions begin to touch the lives of those around us. A life surrendered to God is a light shining in the darkness. It doesn't require grand pronouncements or impressive feats. It simply requires faithfulness, authenticity, and that light, however small it may seem, illuminates paths, warms hearts, and points others to Christ. Have you ever stopped to consider the power of a surrendered life? It's not something that can be measured or explained. It's something that's felt, perceived, experienced. It's a transformative power. When you choose to obey God in the quiet moments, when you trust Him even when you feel nothing, when you persevere through the storms, you demonstrate the power of the gospel. You show the world that there's something more, something eternal. Something worth more than any fleeting pleasure. And your testimony, even if you don't realize it, plants seeds of faith in the hearts of those who observe you. But don't think this life is lived by your own strength. Don't fall into the trap of believing that everything depends on you. The Christian walk begins with God, continues with God, and ends with God. He is the author and finisher of your faith, the one working in you both to will and to do. He strengthens your weary legs and straightens your crooked paths. And in the end, He is the one who receives all the glory. Remember this. You're not called to be perfect. You're called to be faithful. You're not called to have all the answers. You're called to trust one who does. You're not called to understand the entire path. You're called to follow and in the end, He is the one who receives all the glory. Remember this. You're not called to be perfect. You're called to be faithful. You're not called to have all the answers. You're called to trust one who does. You're not called to understand the entire path. You're called to follow You'll see that God was with you every moment, even when you didn't feel Him. You'll see that His promises never failed, that His grace was sufficient, that His presence was constant. And one day when you stand face to face with Him, you will understand that every act of obedience, every surrender, every sacrifice was just a glimpse, a shadow of the glory that awaited you. Because what God has for us is far greater, far more glorious than anything we can imagine. So keep going. Don't give up. Don't let the storms of life or the winds of doubt blow you off course. Don't let your feelings define your walk. Stand firm in God's will. Trust in Christ's faithfulness, and know that even now, in the silence, in the weariness, in the doubt, God is working in you, shaping your faith, strengthening your will, and preparing you for the immeasurable joy that lies ahead. Remember His words, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:1-2. That grace is your strength, that power is your guarantee, and the God who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Trust Him, obey Him, live for Him every day with all that you are. Write in the comments, "Jesus, heal my heart," if you believe He can bring peace and restoration to your soul. Share this message so it can touch and help others who, like you and me, are seeking a deeper walk of faith and prayer.